Hi guys, this is Sai Kumar Kortiwada. In this video, we will learn about React Context API. So what are the things which we will cover in this video? Let's see that. So here, what we'll cover is, first we'll try to understand what exactly the props drilling is and what is a problem with that props drilling and how to avoid that props drilling by using Context API. And even we can achieve this Context API usage in two ways. One is by using provider consumer approach, and one more thing is use context approach. And this use context is a hook which came in functional components after 16 version. So that's why we will be creating a use context as well, and I'll show the difference between these two. We will work only with the functional components for now, but I'll show in both the approaches, provider and consumer approach and use context approach. So let me quickly jump into Visual Studio Code and let me explain you what exactly the props drilling is. For example, this is my app component. So I'll just remove all the content in the app.js, and what I'll do is I'll create two files. One is child1.js and I have something called as child2.js. So these are my two files. So what I want to do is I want to pass some data from my app.js into child1, and from there I want to pass it to child2. That means child1 does not need any of the properties, but for passing to the child2 we need that. For this sake, what I'll do is I'll try to create the nested components first. Coming to the nested components, app.js will receive child1 as the first child component. So what I'll do is I'll add a child1 and just I'll try to import it and I'll use this. But let me create a component first. So I have a code snippet which I used from my marketplace, and that is related to the React one. So you can see, just type this and you can install this particular snippet. This helps us to create the components in faster way. That is the boilerplate code. So RFCE. So this is a snippet. It will create a functional component. So it created the functional component with the file name, whatever you gave. So child1 is the file name. Hence, we can create this particular component and I can use this component in my app.js. So already I have this, and let me import this. So I have imported this child1, and let me go to child2 and do the same thing, RFCE, and hit enter. You have created child2. Now the child2 is nested under child1. So let me go into the child1, and what I'll do is I'll just create child2 component and import it. So now app.js contains child1, child1 contains child2. What I want to do is I want to create a random number. So let me go and create the random number. Const random number and set random number, and now I'll create a state called as use state because it is a very simple one. So I'm creating a use state. So let me give a 0. Now what I'll do is I'll try to add a button in my parent. So parent have the capability to update that particular random number. So update random number and save this. Now on this I have on click event where I can use a arrow function for updating my random number. Set random number. I can copy this and paste here, and what it does is it takes a parameter of random from mathematical library. So math.random number will give a random number, and that random number I want to display in child2. So child2 should receive the random number, but there is no connectivity between app and child2. The only connectivity between child2 and app is child1. So child1 is an intermediate component where I have to pass the data to the child1. Child1 will be responsible for passing the data to child2. So now what I'll do is I'll update one property in child1, that is nothing but random number. So let me copy this random number is equal to random number. So instead of getting confused, what I'll do is I'll just add a number and save this. Now I'm passing this random number to child1. Now child1 have the capability to receive it because it's a props. So props, I can receive this props, and now I'll pass that particular prop to the child2. What I'll do is I'll use the same property for child2 as well, and here what I'll do is props dot number and save this. Now child1 pass the detail to child2, so child2 will receive that again with the props. So let me display that value. So let me use child2 hyphen, and I want to display that props dot number value and save this. Now let me go to the output first, and you can see here there is a child1 and child2 with a 0. I'll use app as well. So let me use an app like paragraph app component and save this. Now app component is a parent one, child one is the child of app component, child 2 is the child of child 1 component, and now it is acting like an intermediate component. Now app component, from the app component I am using this update random button. When I click this update random button, the random number should be updated in my child 2. Is it updating or not? Let me click this. So it got updated in child 2. Let me click again. It is updating always with the child 2 component. But let's consider a way where app component need to send for the 10th child component. That means 10th nested child. So app is containing 1, 1 is containing 2, 2 is containing 3. Like that, if you are going on nesting and you want to send the data from app component to 10th child, then it's very hard. So it is not that much easy. You are disturbing all the 9 components just to pass the data from app component to child 2. That is not always a proper solution. So how to solve this? And this problem is called as props drilling. So we are just drilling the props one after the other into the nested components, and here the thing is we are not using that prop anywhere in the intermediate components. So even if you are using it the 6th child component also, then all you need to pass from 1st to 6th component. So you are disturbing all the components. It is not always recommended to use this approach. So that is why we have to avoid this props drilling problem. So to avoid this props drilling problem, we came up with one more technique called as context API. So first thing is how to avoid props drilling. Props drilling can be avoided by using context API. So how to create the context API? First step to create the context API is just create a variable out of your functional component that is nothing but random context. So I'm giving a name for this called as random context, and I'm using something called as react dot create context. I'm using from React library, and I'm using react dot create context. So these will create the context for you, and this will hold that context. That means it is the mediator to pass from source to destination. So who is our source? App component is our source. So what I'll do is I'll wrap this random context as a component in my app, because that is the one which is sending the data. So it is a source for my context. So whenever I use this context, I have to pass a value. So let me go with random context dot. There are two things. One is provider who is sending the data. One is consumer who will pick that data. So let me use a provider and close this. And now I can just put it over here. I am wrapping whole provider in my app component. That means whatever the components which are nested inside the app, all the components will have access to that value, but where we are passing the value. So there is a default value property for my provider, and that is called as value, and I am passing random number which I want to update. So let me pass this. Now I don't want to pass it to child one. I don't want to maintain any of the mediator. So what I'll do is I'll just remove this and save this. Let me go into child one. I'll just remove this as well, and I want to remove the props. So now child one is a mediator which is not receiving any value from the app component. But because of this context, I can send this random number to any of the nth child. That means if you have 10 nested childs, you can pass from 1 till 10 to anyone. And if you start your provider, or if you start your source at any intermediate child, then from that intermediate child, if you start at 5th component, from 5th till 10th, every child component can receive it. So now I am giving it a root level, so all the components under this can use that particular value. So we have source which we are passing the data, but how to receive it? So here, whenever it is receiving, it can be done in two ways. So before 16 and after 16 we can consider. I'm exporting this context to use in another component. So who is the receiver here? The receiver is child 2. So let me go into the child 2 and receive the value. So how to receive that value? There are two approaches as I mentioned. First thing is consumer approach. So let me go with the consumer approach. What this consumer approach will do is, for example, I want to print the value over here. So what I can do, I can just write something like random context dot consumer, because it is consuming the value. So whenever it is consuming the value, there is no property to pass to that consumer. It is only like a receiver, so it has to receive the value. So what this consumer context will do is it will give you a callback, and the callback will hold that value. So like for example, I'm using value, and let me use here, and let me return this statement over here, and this is like a number. So instead of props dot number, I'll use value. So here also I'm not using props, because the callback of that consumer itself will give you the value which is passed by the source. So now the source will pass the random number, that random number will be received inside this callback, and that is received as a value, and that value can be shown over here. So you can write anything over here. It's not only the value, you can give any of the variable. It is like a variable. So let me go here and now refresh. So we have a child one, and let me hit update random number. So it is not working. What's the problem? Let's see. So we have consumer. So let me inspect this. Let's see what any error we have. No. So now the case is child 2 is receiving the value, and this is the received value. So now this random context dot consumer should receive the value. Hence we are showing that value, and the problem is here we have to return some value. Let me save this, and now you can see the random number. Let me refresh this. The default value is 0, and when I hit this random number, it got updated. And that is where we are passing the value from our app component to any of the child component. If you want to use a child 10th, go to the child 10th and just write this and wrap your content wherever you require. So whenever you wrap this content, you will be getting a callback function, and with that callback function we can use this. So for example, there is a problem in this approach. I'll tell you what is the problem. It is not related to the performance or any stuff, but whenever we want to have multiple contexts, then this will create a lot of problem. For example, I have something called as export const, and let me use a counter is equal to, I am creating one more context called as create context of 0. I want to pass the 0 value, and now I'm suffixing this with context. So I want to pass some value to this context as well. So counter context dot provider, and this provides some value. So let me use some value, and the value is one of the state. Let me copy this, put it over here, and I'm using something called as counter, and this is something called as set counter. So now there should be a button to increment this. Let me copy this, put it over here, and just change this to set counter, and I'm changing the counter with the previous state. So what I'll do is I'll use a counter plus 1 and update counter. So I have two contexts, and these two contexts should be received by our components. That can be anything. So one component receive, one component can receive only random number, one component can receive only counter, or one component can receive both. So whatever the components we have under this app component, all the components have the access to this random context as well as counter context. So now what I'm doing is I'm using both of them in one case. So I want to show both of them here, like a random number here and followed by another context. So if you want to use such type of multiple context, then what we have to do, the problem here is this should be not written directly. Instead, this will have one more component, so something like return, and I can use counter context dot consumer. So I'm returning this element. Again, this element will receive a value called as counter value, and this has to return our main content. So our main content is return, and a div with the child 2 as a label, and I want to pass the value, that means the consumer value from the random context, and I want to pass the value of my counter. So let me save this. Now go here, you can see 0 and 0 by default. When I click on the counter, the last value is getting triggered and it is getting updated. When I click on random number, only the random number is getting updated. But when you see this approach, it is bit confusing and it is not in a standard way. We are writing lot of boilerplate code just to get some set of values. For this case, React 16 plus versions has updated with one of the hook. That hook will change everything in your UI. So how it changes and how we can replace this code with a minimal lines of code by using useContext. So useContext is a hook which reduced all the consumer logics, and it reduced the way how we wrote before. So how we are trying to write this many lines we wrote, and we can reduce into minimal of 1-2 lines only. So how we can do that? There also the context API works the same way. the provider and the context creation, everything is common. But whenever you are trying to receive it, we can use context. So how can I do that? Const. So I'm using a value here. So let me put the value over here and I'll use context. This is the named hook and this is a named export, and we can pass the context, which context I want to use. So I want to use the random context. So let me pass the random context, and I have something called as counter, which is related to the counter context. So let me copy this counter, put it over here. So now we can use context and pass the context value. So the context value is counter context, and now you are receiving a value and you are receiving the counter value. So no need to write all this stories. Instead, just you can copy this particular div, put it over here. It works the same way. So let me go here and refresh. Now it is 0 and 0. Let me click on this. It is updating the last value. When I click on this, it is updating the random value. Instead of writing lot of code, we just wrote 3 lines of code. One is for getting the random context value, and one is for getting the counter context value, and one is for displaying purpose. That's it. It is not having lot of JSX code. Instead, we have reduced by using useContext. So you can use any of the approach. Before 16 version of React, then you have to use only this approach. You don't have hooks before 16. Once after 16, we came up with hooks and everything. That's why you can use any of this. So now let me go here. I'll show you one more problem, and that is not solved in this video. We will be solving in the upcoming video. I'll show you what the problem is. So let me go here and save this. Now what I want to do is I want to console this. So let me go here, console dot log off. This is child1. So let me give child1 and save this. Let me copy this console and let me give the child2. So I'll just go here and just add something like child2, and now let me hit enter. Now format. If you observe, so this child2 is not receiving any of the props or states, and there is no updates in my child1. So if you go to child2, you have some updates because the value is getting changed and the counter value is getting changed, but there are no updates in child1. In that case, what happens? Let me go here and clear this off. Let me refresh this. So for the first time, child1 and child2 got called. That's fine. When I update the counter, again the child1 is getting re-rendered and child2 is also getting re-rendered. Actually speaking, the child1 is not even receiving any props, and we are not sending any of the data from app component to child1. But with this update of state in a particular component, it is updating all our child components as well. That is not always expected. Why? Because your child component can be like very large, so you can have a very big content in that particular component which is doing lot of operations. In that case, re-rendering unwanted components is not always recommended. So how to solve that? For solving this, we came up with some other approach, and that approach is nothing but pure components. So how to design a pure component, how to use a functional pure component, all this we'll learn and we'll cover in the upcoming videos. Stay tuned, and that's it for this video. How to use context and how to use consumer provider APIs. That is nothing but context API. That's it for this video. Hope you like my explanation. If you like my video, like, share, subscribe to my channel for more updates. Signing off. Thank you.